Hello to everybody. Today we're talking about the mix of people who we employ in the construction sector. We're looking at how important diversity of thought is to manage through the many challenges that our industry presents us. And we're going to delve into the ways to promote and support these key people we have in any organisation. And we're really honoured today to have Danny Clarke, who's the Engagement Director for the Construction Industry Training Board, and who is passionate about diversity within the industry and the strength that that's going to deliver for all our businesses. Danny, good afternoon.
Good afternoon, Mark. Thanks for having me.
Not at all. We normally start with asking you to put in your own words what you're up to and what your organisation does, and particularly your role that you see you're trying to deliver in improving our industry. So over to you.
Wow, that's a big challenge, Mark. So yeah, I'm Engagement Director for England for the Construction Industry Training Board. So we work with contractors of all sizes to have a skilled and competent workforce now and into the future is our strapline, as I'm sure you know, and many people listening to this will know.
Absolutely.
My particular areas of expertise in this regard, since we're talking about EDI and diversity and inclusion, is I set up the top 100 most influential women in construction awards. For those that may know, that was a program specifically designed to support women and non-binary individuals in the construction industry, and that was a few years ago now. And it came about from conversations that we was having within the community itself. So we used to run monthly networking groups, and you should talk about soft skills and have a bit of a networking session for various individuals. And one of the ongoing themes that we had was that people felt they weren't enough, I guess is probably the best way to put it. So with all the statistics that we often see, anywhere between 14 and 18% of the industry are female, and lots of people would say, yes, we need to get more, and we need to do more, we need to recruit and retain more females in the sector. And one of the messages, or one of the comments that was made within the community was this feeling of inadequacy, this feeling of that I wasn't enough. And it kind of prompted this viewpoint of, well, actually, no, there's lots of people that potentially feel like that. And we need to recognise those that work here already whilst working towards trying to attract more diversity into the sector. And it really resonated, and it led to the creation of that programme and the ongoing legacy programme as well, to really be able to say, look, here are 100 amazing women doing fantastic things at a local level or a national level, and let's engage with them, let's create a community to support, and let's kind of work forwards. So that's kind of one of the things I've been involved with. The other thing that I was kind of pioneering was the neurodiversity programs. So in a previous role at the NFB, we commissioned some research on neurodiversity, and this was born out from a few conversations where we were speaking to various individuals who had a mindset of that construction seemed to be where people ended up who were potentially non-academic, or it was, you're not academic, therefore have you considered a career in construction or the military? And there was that associated viewpoint that the industry was made up of various individuals with neurodivergent conditions. But actually trying to find that sector base, that evidence base, was really difficult. Outside of anecdotal, well, I was in a room and half of them were autistic, these engineers, and you go, well, that's not really a scientific based sample. So we commissioned some research, and it highlighted what a lot of people knew, to be fair, but that was that 1 in 4 people were neurodiverse in construction. And maybe with these different learning styles and the ways that we actually look at the educational systems, not knocking the educational systems, by the way, maybe we are a natural home for certain people that maybe struggle with certain academic type qualifications and assessments. And that might be where people feel more, what's the best way to put it, comfortable in being assessed through on the tools or on the site assessments and the job activities. And actually a lot of the trades that use your hands maybe are better suited for people that learn in that way.
And I think Danny, we can come back to, I mean, I'd quite like to explore with you the idea of the variation we have within the sector. But do you want to just tell us why and how important diversity is? Because it's not a means and its end, is it? There's several benefits to everybody for having that diversity within the industry.
Yeah, 100%. So listen, you can go and do any research from McKinsey through to local anecdotal trade feds and lots of other research that's been undertaken in terms of the value of having women on boards, the value of having more equal representation across other minority groups, and the impact that that has on productivity, on efficiencies, on effectiveness, on financial performance. It's there. So from a clearly hard-faced business perspective, you don't really need to be, or you shouldn't really need much convincing as to the benefits of diversity. I think part of the danger is it challenges the status quo, and people that look like them, sound like them, think like them, are educated like them, and generally will concur with their outlook on things, and people that will generally have similar viewpoints to come to the same conclusions. And what diversity will do is challenge that thinking and actually ultimately make you a better person. But not everyone's comfortable to do that, I guess.
No. I mean, do you think there's a reason, Danny, why we find it particularly difficult in construction to cope with that challenge? I mean, I've heard it said that life's difficult enough at construction. If we've got the same people around us, then that's one less conflict to have. But I don't know. I mean, is there a reason why we're struggling to attract people into the industry? Because we've got, as you say, we've got 100 women you've just presented again this year as being doing fantastic work up and down the country, some fantastic role models, and yet we're still struggling to get above that 14 to 16%, which we know is just far too low.
You know, Mark, that's a very good question. If I had the answer, I'd probably be a billionaire, if I'm brutally honest, and I'd certainly commercialize it. I think, no, jokes aside, I think part of the challenge is representation, and part of it is culture. I think is the politest way to put it. Let's have it right. There's 186 roles in construction. Across all of the industry, there's so many opportunities for people, and I always say, and people that have heard me speak before will know, I bang the drum to say it's the best industry to work in. There's no other industry in the world that touches the parts of our lives like construction. However, there are still pockets of, I'm going to use the term resistance, I think is probably the wrong term to use, but there are pockets of resistance, and the underlying culture where sometimes people don't feel welcome if they stand out from the norm, and that could be from an age perspective, it could be a race perspective, a sexuality perspective, a gender perspective, and many other things that people that maybe don't sit within social norms are not made to feel as welcome as potentially they could be. And that's a horrible thing to say. And actually, I speak daily with hundreds of organisations who don't have that culture.
Yep.
But I think there is a narrative and there is a stereotype that exists, which stems from the minority, and the experiences that people have are abhorrent. But unfortunately, they're the ones that generally get the headlines, as opposed to the millions of people going to work every day and having a pleasant experience.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's food for a different podcast, Danny, on why the media only looks at bad news rather than good news.
Absolutely.
The other thing which I think it'd be worth just telling everybody about is your definition of neurodiversity. I mean, you touched on it on your first answer, but it is actually you can measure neurodiversity, and it's understanding what that means to people would be helpful.
Well, that's a good question, Mark, if I'm honest. So it's essentially, for me, neurodiversity is a combination of people who have neurodivergent conditions. So people that have we're talking things like ADHD, autism, dyslexia, dyspraxia, dyscalculia, Tourette's, and it's people that generally have a condition whereby their brain activity is not neurotypical. Although one could argue what is neurotypical, I guess.
I have to say, yes. Not sure you or I fall into that typical category anyway.
No, I'd agree with that, to be fair. And I think that's generally the umbrella term that's used to describe people or communities that have these conditions and these neurodivergent conditions. Yeah, that's generally the way I'd describe it.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, it's a good question and makes me think.
Well, I think it's crucial for the industry, isn't it? Because actually getting those people to thrive requires a slightly different approach to management, doesn't it? And do you want to just sort of explain some of the management techniques you have for dealing with people who are you know, don't want to use on the spectrum, but on that, have that diversity of thought or thinking processes.
Yeah, 100%. Yeah, I'm happy to do that. So one of the things that we'll often hear, and I've heard this throughout my career, is the need to treat everybody the same and treat others as you'd like to be treated yourself, and all these stereotypical phrases that no doubt others that listen to this would have heard over the years. And the reality is that doesn't work, and it doesn't work for a number of reasons, but predominantly it doesn't work because we're all humans and we all have our own individual characteristics, traits, and things that we kind of connect with, and things that turn us off, I think is probably the politest way to put it. So I'd say this would apply to neurodivergent individuals as much as people that suffer other health conditions, for example, or other challenges in performing day-to-day activities that some people take for granted as being normal, and whatever that is. But for me, it's the most important thing really is to engage with the individual and actually understand what their triggers are, what works for them, and actually trying to adapt our approach. So, for example, if you talk to certain individuals with autistic type traits, sometimes we can kind of not give clear direction or clear instructions. And one that I say happens quite a lot is when you say to people, "Oh, just play the game. Just play the game. Surely you know how to play the game." But actually, some people can take that at literal terms and will go off on a tangent to say, "Well, what game am I playing? What are the rules? How long are we playing for? Who wins? Who loses?" And all these other things. But that's not what I meant. Well, then you really need to look at what it is that you're being asked to do. So I always try and use a really clear, clean feedback table, which is, what is it that have you seen, heard, observed, witnessed? What does it mean in practice? So what is happening, and what's the thing you're trying to change? But then what's the impact? So, for example, you'd say, well, I heard this from X number of colleagues. This means that this isn't happening, and the impact on that not happening is this. And being really clear and direct and as black and white as you can be really benefits people that maybe have certain traits that they go, okay, I'm really clear on what you need me to do. That works. Other ones that I'd say will be really interesting are generally people that have ADHD, typically known to procrastinate according to research and put things off. And having deadlines is really hard, but some managers don't like to give somebody a really hard and fast deadline of you need to have this done by this date. Well, actually, chances are they need a date to be able to really focus on it and get things done. I know myself, I always need a deadline. Otherwise, I will just kick things into long grass generally, if I'm honest. And it's just been clear that what will work for me in terms of giving me a deadline won't work for somebody else because they're individual as well. And I think the best thing I'd say in terms of teams is something that, funnily enough, we did at NFB and I've used in a few different places, which is to have like a user manual. And that's one of the, if your team's big enough, I'll rephrase that. If your team isn't too big, it's a really good tool to use, which is how do you engage with somebody? What works for them? So what motivates them? What frustrates them? And how do you get the best out of them? So my user manual that I've used in many organizations, and if my boss is listening, I've shared it with her as well. But it generally says, in terms of communication, my priority list would be speak to me in person, speak to me on the phone, and only as a last resort, send me an email. And if you're going to send me an email, please don't make it War and Peace. Use bullet points if you can, because I have to really condition myself to read long, lengthy papers because it's hard work. It's hard going. And actually, by sharing that with people, then you find that others will turn around and say, I'd much prefer to send an email. If you need me to do something, send me an email. I really need you to talk to me like this. I really need the background. Don't speak to me on the phone because that's overwhelming for me. Well, that works as well. And you try to find that middle ground as to work with me, this is what gets the best out of me. To work with you, I need to potentially adapt my style to accommodate what you need. Now, the common one I'd say on this, and this is one that's come up for me a few times, and if I'm going on, please stop me, is simple little things. I can sometimes be perceived to be quite abrupt on email. So I'll give one word answers. Thanks, yes, no problem, great. And actually other members of my team in the past have generally fed back to say, look, I need you to say hello, how are you? How was your weekend? Kind regards. And they feel that if they don't get that, then they're doing something wrong. And it's more the fact that I write like I speak, and actually I've had to adapt my style to say, there is no offence intended. It is just that I probably get, as many do, hundreds of emails every day, and to do that on every email is really time consuming.
Yeah.
And it's not that I don't care, it's just that I'd much rather ask you in person because that's my communication style. But actually learning from or hearing and creating that space, I guess, is probably the best way to put it. Creating that space where somebody feels comfortable to say, this is what I need to get the best out of me at work, is a really good way to then understand, well, if I want to do that as a leader of a team, I need to adapt my style somewhat so that I understand where they're coming from. But equally, setting the ground lines to say, if that doesn't happen where you don't get that from me, it isn't intentional, let me know, because I don't mean any intense. Because broadly speaking, if I was upset with something, I'd normally address it and say, by the way, I need you to do this.
Yeah. I mean, Danny, I think a number of points there, which I think are just worth remembering, is that it's down to the managers who want to manage their people to get the best out of them. And that is the responsibility of a manager, to manage in the best effective way to get the best out of their team. Because we know replacing people in a team is arduous, expensive, and time consuming. And you also, if you're losing diversity, even, you've got the law of unintended consequences then. But it's also, I thought it's interesting, your point there about the team itself. So if you're working with somebody who's neurally diverse, you actually need to be making that, those changes yourself to be able to get the best out of the team that's flowing. And I guess to the last point, the cultural differences you need to make to allow people who are neurally diverse to stand up and say, if you want the best out of me, this is how you need to address me and work with me, is a real challenge. And I think, I'm not sure we're there yet as an industry to allow people who have those differences to be able to stand up and say, I need to be dealt with in a certain way.
I think you're right, Mark, to be fair, but I'd push that back onto the organisation and the team leaders and the managers themselves to say, how are you creating that psychologically safe space where people feel able and comfortable to share that information? It is a big thing to suddenly put yourself out there to say, this is who I am, this is what I need, because generally speaking, a lot of times it comes as about through a disciplinary, through an onboarding process, and you need to declare this. And even the terms we use, you need to declare this. It's quite a big thing to suddenly say, well, what's the consequences of declaring this, rather than just saying, hi, welcome to the organisation, is there anything you need? How can we work together? And sometimes it's setting that scene, which is why whenever I've used the user manual in the past, I'm always the first one. If I'm leading the team, I'll stand up and say, this is who I am, by the way, this really frustrates me, this is what motivates me, this is how to communicate, please don't feel that you can't chase me, blah, etc, etc. And I'll try and set the scene by being quite open and transparent to say, this is who I am, and we are all that team, we are all one team. Because if whilst we're talking about neurodiversity, but if we can create that space where people feel safe and able to raise anything, we're in a better place. Whether this is, so we talk about it from a neurodiverse perspective, we could talk about it from a mental health and wellbeing perspective, we can talk about it from accidents, because if they feel safe and supported, they're more likely to report this happened rather than try and bury it. And that's probably links into some of the behavioural safety stuff I've done elsewhere with other companies, where you want people to be open and honest, because then you can work with it.
So Danny, I mean, one of the things which I think we both agree on is that culture is driven from the top. It's directed by the directors, and that is the culture that you then get. And as you're probably aware, I'm very keen on risk registers at the board level. What would you put on a risk register for as sort of red flags for how a company does or doesn't treat its staff who have neurodiversity?
Oh, that's a very good question. The risk there for me is the same with many things. It's the risk is people, and that could be retention of people. It could link into productivity. So whilst I'd have the risk as an opportunity, probably as people based. God, you've really caught me on the hop there, Mark. I think it crosses over with a number of the risks that would already be on a corporate risk register. But the main one being legislatively, there are certain characteristics and certain conditions that would be covered by the Equality Act, and making sure you're across those.
Yes, I think for me, Dan, I think that one of the challenges are we've got such a badly diverse boards in our sector.
Yeah.
actually they don't actually know the right questions to be asking at board level to ensure that they're getting the best out of the teams they're going to be getting. And coming back to that cultural issue, I think it's, for me, it's putting that, what is the culture we want in our company and what's it got to deliver? Because that for me is a key risk in changing times. You need that diversity of thought if you're going to survive.
I would say personally, I'd go back a step. Why do you need this culture to change? Why do you need to do this? Because equally, what I've found with certain organisations, especially around the EDI agenda, and again, I'll say this politely, is that you'll see that I need to be really careful how I say this. But you'll see that there'll suddenly be this positive discrimination route where people say we have to attract more women, we have to recruit more women, we have to go down what the NFL called the Rooney rules, and actually we need to mandate certain percentages and things like that. And actually, what that does is it puts people in an awkward position, because on the coal face, then you have people saying, well, you've only got the job because you are this characteristic, as opposed to you've got it because you're the best person for the job.
Yeah.
And the problem with that is that they are then fighting a battle with the teams they're working within, as well as the wider organisation, having to prove their competence, which isn't fair and isn't proper.
No.
The other thing that sometimes happens is there are token appointments whereby you need a female on the board. Let's appoint them with no responsibilities, no jurisdictions, no projects to manage. In which case they kind of come in, the culture of the organisation isn't ready, and then they shortly leave, and the organisations go, but hey, guess what? We tried. Well, no, you didn't try hard enough.
Absolutely.
Why have you appointed them in the first place? What is it you've tried to get them to do? What's their remit? The other thing I'd say in terms of diversity of the boards, you've got me on my soapbox, is that when we talk about diversity, people generally go down what we see in terms of age, gender, race, to a degree, sexuality. But what they don't go into is cognitive diversity, because again, people will go, well, this person went to my university, they was taught by the same person as me, they grew up in my local town, they do this, they're like me, they're one of us. And you go, it doesn't matter what they look like, you are not going to get that cognitive diversity from somebody who has exactly the same makeup and experiences as somebody else. You want that different viewpoint for somebody to go, hang on a second, have you considered it like this?
Yeah.
Have you considered it, if we did this, this would be the outcome? No, because you haven't got that viewpoint. And that's one of the things that I'd always encourage.
It's crucial, isn't it?
100%. Yeah.
Crucial. I mean, you mentioned there positive discrimination, Danny. Do you think there's ever a case for positive discrimination or not?
There's always a case. You can always make a case for it. Let's be fair.
That's different. You can always make a case, but
yeah,
I mean, I have the same. I would agree with your premise that actually it puts people puts everybody in a very difficult position.
It does, and I think this is the balance that needs to be struck. So I can see from past conversations with other bodies where there will be this requirement to mandate a percentage of X number of females in the industry and in the organisations. But my kickback to that would be, what happens when you get to that level? What happens if you have a target of 25%, but you're operating at 30%? Does that mean you can reduce the numbers, or should we just be looking at it from a let's get the right let's look at the underlying support mechanisms and things like that, so that people can all operate at a similar level and be recruited and all that jazz. But all things considered, as an organisation and as a workforce, you want the person that's going to be the best person for the job to be in that post. And that's what you want within a team operating environment as well. And realistically, it shouldn't matter, and I say this in my utopian world, where they come from, what they look like, the languages they speak, and anything like that. It should be there on merit. Mm-hmm. We're not there though, and that's where I think the positive discrimination thing does have a case, and in terms of trying to promote these opportunities to a wider pool, but understanding what support's needed from these other groups to even be at the table to have the interview. Like, we take for granted the fact that in our industry, a lot of recruitment is informal. You know someone who knows someone who finds a job.
Yeah.
But not everybody has that opportunity. We take for granted that everyone can sit an interview, which isn't always the case. We take for granted that people can afford to pay for a train journey to an interview, which isn't the case. We take for granted that the job descriptions that we write will be applicable for everybody, and it isn't. You go back to the neurodiversity piece. The literacy rates in in the industry across England as a whole is anywhere between 8 and 11, depends on which research report you.
Yeah.
But yet
Yeah.
we still write academically, and you think,
Mhm.
well, why? Who is that appealing to? So again, you straight away you kind of go from a large pool with all these other caveats. You suddenly shrink that pool down to a really small group because we've not thought about how do we open it up to as many people as possible to give everybody the opportunity
Yeah.
that we've had. And that's not an easy answer, but that's where
It's
we should be thinking to work towards.
Yeah, I mean, it's not easy. You have to be very wary of the law of unintended consequences as well. I mean, my daughter worked for a large contractor, and their client insisted on having a certain number of women on site at any one time. So what happened was that my daughter was on site effectively 15, 16 hours a day because they had to meet this target of having
Yeah,
women on site because there simply aren't enough women in contracting. She didn't last.
absolutely.
She didn't last the stay. She didn't last because that
It's-
just
But
made the problem even worse.
but again, it's that unintended consequences. But somebody in the organisation would have known that that was going on and thought that's
Yes.
okay because we're hitting another metric. But
Yeah, yeah,
you're not looking after your people, and I'd say that applies to a number of stories that I've heard over the years. But equally, some of the really bad things that have happened that I've heard about, where people report things that are criminal. If I'm honest, to be brutally honest, and then when you go, did you report it? Yes. What happened? Well, they said they'd deal with it once the project's finished. They said they'd deal with it at this point. You go, well, that's not good enough. I'm sorry.
no,
And no
no,
wonder people are leaving when that's sometimes what they're met with,
yeah,
because it's just not acceptable. And I know we went off on a tangent there, but the unintended consequences thing is something where if you actually just stop and think about what you're trying to do, rather than do what you've always done in the way that you've always done it, and take a moment to think, what are the opportunities here? What can I potentially influence? It makes a world of difference. The one I'd say on that, the other one that comes up quite a bit on that, Mark, which is kind of dovetails into the diversity piece, but it's like the targets around apprenticeships where people say on this project you need to have between 10 and 15% apprentices per £1 million, blah blah blah, and you go, brilliant, that's great. Just out of interest, have you factored that into your works plan? No. So I wonder what apprentice we're going to get.
Well,
Are they
they're
going to be
going to
on
be in the
this?
office, don't you? That's what you do now.
Well,
They're going to be marketing and administrative and accounts
and
apprentices.
and they all have absolutely appropriate roles, but the point for me is if you're trying to kind of bring through trades and give contractors the support and the confidence to bring on trade apprentices because it's factored into the work plans and stuff like that, you need to think about it holistically across
Yeah,
multi-channels. But it doesn't happen. You end up, as you say, with apprentices that won't necessarily be on site, but from a client perspective, they've given you what they need because they've got 15% apprentices. It just,
as you
yeah,
know, we had a 10% rule for apprentices on my old business, and or 10% apprentices and trainees. But we got to the point where exactly that happened. We had an old ground worker who's taken apprentice every year, and he refused. He said, "You're not going to let me. If that apprentice puts that curb brace in incorrectly, he needs to take it out so he learns his lesson. And you're not going to let me do that because you haven't got time to take it out on the program."
yeah. You
And
have,
he was absolutely spot on.
yeah, absolutely. And you have that, but you also had that with the bricklaying gangs when they're paid per brick.
Yeah,
And then to take an apprentice is going to slow down, which means it's going to cost them money, and nobody factors that in, or very
no,
few factors that in to say, well, let's think about it properly. Yes, we need to get the apprentices in, but what support packages in place for them? What experience are they going to get within these organisations to make sure that they come out through their apprenticeship at their endpoint assessments competent without negatively impact on the teams
yeah,
that are supporting them and the companies that are employing them?
yeah, yeah. I, Danny, I'd like to just while we're talking about apprentices, one of the things which I'm, as you know, very tied up with being a governor of a construction college. We have to get our apprentices through maths and English. And you talked earlier about some of the academics not coming in, well, people who are not academic coming into the industry. And we're losing a lot of people through, people are failing their apprentices simply can't get maths and English sorted out. Do you think do you have a view on how we might solve that conundrum? Or do we just dispense with maths and English? Or we just got to be much more intelligent about how we go and try and get them through a qualification, if not the qualification?
Um, So this is an interesting viewpoint, and I'll speak on behalf of myself as opposed to the organisation for which I represent. However, they are interlinked ultimately. What I would say in terms of um, the outlook on this would be that a lot of people you speak to that maybe wouldn't get the GCSE Pythagoras rules and things like that are very good at maths and English. And vocationally, asking them how many bricks does it take to build this wall, they would be able to understand.
Yeah.
And I do wonder whether there is a way to meet the middle ground where we have the requirements from a technical perspective around English and maths, but it's more vocational in its basis to actually make it apply in practice, and make it more relevant to what they're trying to do. I go back, so I did relatively well at English and maths at school. How much of that have I used in my career? Very little. I'm not going to lie. But yeah, I was able. So I'm one of these people that are, because of the way my brain works, I'm pretty good at exams. I could retain information and decipher it and push it on. Coursework, I wasn't so good at because I'd leave it to the last minute. But give me an exam and I was. But I've not used it. So actually, how does you having a GCSE maths English with the educational system, and I know this is the frustration from many in the educational system, actually benefit them on site with the work that they do, and make it more relevant to the industry that they're working within? May well be one opportunity to kind of retain people. I'd say.
I think it's crucial because I mean, one of the figures I saw, and you'll know whether it's accurate or not, is up to a third of apprentices are failing their maths and English, which means they don't actually complete their apprenticeship. Which is, if that is the case, it's a huge indictment on the process that we've got. Because what we're actually saying is that the industry we've got, or the system we've got for bringing people into the industry, is probably not fit for purpose. Now, there's a bit of a bold statement for somebody who's representing the CITB.
and I have to be really mindful of how I get into that conversation, Mark.
Okay, well, let's move on.
What I would say is that there is a piece of work that is exploring. There's a piece of work with competency frameworks and routes to competence. Is probably the best way to put it, and how that makes sure that it takes as many people with us as possible is probably the right outcome that we hopefully will kind of address some of these challenges.
Brilliant. It's the sort of thing that CITB is involved in anyway, isn't it?
It is, yeah.
So that's, we've got people with the right ideas, or people with that diversity of thought batting for us within the CITB, which is great.
Yeah, and what I'd say in terms of the skill system itself is there's aspects of it work, and there's aspects that can be administered and delivered better.
Brilliant. Danny, I can't let you go without having a quick word on mental health. You and I have seen an absolute tsunami of mental health issues come through our industry in the last 15 years, probably 20 years. And don't need to look at what the causes of that are, because I think they're mixed and varied. But clearly, our industry is still grappling with the consequences of this tsunami. Do you have any sort of? Do you have any pointers? Because it's something very different from neurodiversity. It's but actually that listening and support could be seen as common across the two.
Well, one thing I would say is that there is actually I've started to I started to look into it a little bit more, and there is a link between neurodiversity and mental health. So there is something called rejection sensitivity disorder, and essentially it's how do I describe it? It's perceived criticism, rejection, failure, and whether it could be perceived or it could be real, and it really affects people insofar as that people will be having more emotional, intense reactions. So they could be extreme distress, rage. They're sensitive to criticism. There's other physical symptoms like sweating and nausea and stuff like that, and they withdraw from social environments, so they fear rejection, so therefore they don't put themselves into those situations, which affects personal growth, relationships, but also from a workplace perspective. If they're withdrawing from a social interaction, suddenly you're not part of the team, you're not getting on, and suddenly people feel that you're being isolated. I'm just going to have a quick look, because I like to quote the correct statistic, but there was 30% of people that have got ADHD have issues with RSD.
RSD being
the rejection sensitivity disorder.
Oh, right, okay, gosh, so that's a third. That's it's a big number, isn't it?
It's a massive number. And then there's also this thing where neurodiverse individuals are 3 times more likely to experience mental health issues. Which again is that one in
it's the same side of the same coin, isn't it? Yes.
So actually, I wonder whether there is something in the high proportion of people in the industry with neurodiverse conditions and mental health, and whether there is a correlation between that. And that's something that as I say, I've started to read up on it and kind of look into it a little bit more and see what evidence is out there. But it's starting to see whether there is that correlation that exists.
Yeah.
I think the other thing that I'd say in terms of mental health within the industry is very much the structure of the industry and the number of subcontractors, sole traders that work for themselves and project-based work. So at the end of a project, you've suddenly had the pressure to find another job, to find more work, to pay the bills, and all of that type of thing. And I also think sometimes the fact that we are vocal about it, I think, is a good thing, because typical of construction is we've said, here's a problem, we're now going to try and fix it, because that's what we do. We're constructors. We work in the industry. We want to fix something as soon as we know about it, and we'll be vocal about it. I don't think you'll see the statistics of any other industry highlighted and advertised and promoted and publicised as much as you will to do with mental health and construction, which I think is an opportunity. That said, I think we have tended historically to deal with things in the same way, i.e., we'll say to people, you need to speak to somebody. Well, that doesn't work for everybody. What about if people aren't comfortable speaking? So I know, again, I'll speak from my own experiences. When my father passed away and everybody said to me, you need to go and speak to somebody. You need to speak to somebody. I couldn't speak to anybody. But my therapy was writing it down. And I wrote and wrote and wrote. And that worked for me. And that sorted my head out. And I was fine. But everybody would say, you need to speak to somebody. Why? Because it worked for me. Well, it doesn't work for me, actually. So actually finding the different facets of what works. As an industry, we went down the MHFA route, and now we're looking at suicide first aids. But the MHFA route is a sticking plaster. And I say that because a lot of people see that as a one and done. So they'll have an MHFA. They'll say, I don't need to do anything else to do with mental health because I've trained that person over there and they are my support. And I'd say, go back a step. What's your risks? Go back to your culture, the hours, like your daughter 16 hours. That's not a good thing. Look at your risks. Your control measure is MHFA. But there's other things as well. Who supports your MHFAs? Who supports the proactive stuff? Stop waiting for a reactive response. Let's get ahead of the game and actually look at the culture, look at our individuals, look at our teams, look at our risks, then look at controls to see how do we stop people from getting to the point of crisis as far as we can.
Yeah, I mean, it's treating the symptom, not the cause, at a time when our industry is desperately short of competent, skilled people to deliver the basic services that we require. And so, I think we're in a position where businesses are recognizing they're going to have to do something to hold on to the skills and the competence they have. Whether that's treating people differently or recruiting further afield, I don't know.
Bit of both, maybe.
Fingers crossed. Fingers crossed. So, Danny, I'm getting my last question for you. Is you've recently won the Beacon of Empowerment at the Women in Construction Awards. Congratulations!
Thank you very much.
I know it's your tireless work on all this, and you've talked about an industry that presents and advertises the challenge we have in neurodiversity. That's no small part down to you and the work that you're doing, both NFB and now at the CITB. I was going to just sort of finish up with asking for 3 pointers. There's nice, easy 3 pointers for the industry to not necessarily just promote, but also retain women in the industry, because I think I always worry that actually we lose a lot of women that we recruit, and actually retention is, for me, as important as bringing people into the sector.
Yeah, absolutely. So the 3 points, what's the lessons to promote and retain people in the workplace? The first one I'd say, and the reason why the top 100 is as successful as it is because fundamentally it's a community that listens. And that sounds so simple. But actually listening to the problems and the experiences that people within the workplace, the community have, gives you an understanding of what needs to be done about it. Because most people, if you create and facilitate the conversation, will tell you what they think the solution could be.
Yep.
So listen. We have 2 ears and 1 mouth for one reason. Listen to the answers. The other lessons that the industry could do to promote and retain is give them an opportunity. Think about, do you know what? I'm going to go back a step. The first thing to do is look at, why are you promoting? What does it mean for your organisation? And if it isn't, the answer is not broadly around because it's the right thing to do. maybe go back and revisit why you're doing it. If
Yep.
it's because the client's told you to do it, I'd maybe think, what's your motivators and what happens when the client's not telling you to do it? So I'd look at the first lesson. The second lesson would be, why are you doing it, and make sure you're doing it for the right reasons and that you see and understand the benefits.
Yep.
And that kind of ties into the do it for the right reasons, so far as don't just do it as a tick box, make sure that you are promoting the opportunities and supporting people. And then the last lesson I'd have is that create opportunities. People learn from people. Don't be so pig-headed or arrogant that you think you know all the answers. Involve as many people from the organisation or outside and the experts in the field to facilitate what you're trying to achieve. So once you've identified what you're trying to achieve, and if you don't know the answers, do you know what, that is a good starting point because you recognised it. Go and find people that have the answers and get them to support and deliver what you're trying to do, because you could say to them, having done point 2, this is why I'm doing it, this is what I want to achieve, and they will then say, brilliant, this is how you can do it.
Yeah, I think that last point, Danny, is absolutely right. If you take a risk in business, chances are you might not achieve all your goals, but actually what you learn on the way through about everything, all sorts of other things, is invaluable. And actually giving people the opportunity, you suddenly find all sorts of doors can get unlocked. And people, I think you're absolutely right. We're too focused on the here and now. We're not looking laterally enough to be able to pick up some of those other benefits that that diversity of thought and that diversity of people will bring to the business, particularly in all that change we're coping with at the moment. I mean, we're all saying the next 6 years to 2030 is going to be absolutely fastest pace of change many of us have seen us in our business lives. And we're going to need that diversity to be able to cope.
100%. And there's also that thing around knowing the limits of your own competence. So coming back to your corporate risk perspective, what I'd put on there from a personnel perspective is making sure they know the limits of competence, because too often people have a feeling that they need to know the answers because they are a manager, a director, owner. And do you know what? Some of the most liberating experiences is when you say, do you know what? I don't know the answer. Let me go and find it. And actually knowing how far your knowledge extends is a really powerful self-development piece, because then you know where to learn, you know what you need to work on, and you've not got the stress of bluffing, I guess is probably the politest way to put it, and somebody finding out that you don't know what you're talking about.
Yeah. Well, perhaps ISG would have done well to have the limit of their director's competence on their risk register. Don't answer that one, Danny. You don't need to.
What I will say on that one is that anyone that is affected by that fallout, the CITB and Build UK have been in discussions, and we've agreed to waive the duplicate certificate fee for anyone affected. So if anyone does want to get copies of their certificates for SMSTS or triple STS, people are able to access their copies of their certificates without being charged. They just need to get in touch with their local engagement advisor.
That's brilliant. I'm really good message to finish up with, because I know that CITB does an awful lot to support and help the industry throughout throughout its guises. And ISG, biggest insolvency since Carillion, there are going to be a lot of people affected, and it's something which hopefully we can train the industry to be better equipped and less susceptible to these problems. But thank you for that.
No problem. I'm sure you've covered some of the risks, Mark, but I'm sure that would have been covered with the project bank account as well, some of it.
Well, we've done a project bank account podcast already, Danny, so I don't need to ask you on that one.
No. But no, thank you, mate.
Danny, it's been an absolute pleasure running through with you on your home territory, on your passion for diversity and thought processes in the industry. You absolutely deserve the Beacon Award at the Women in Construction, because you're an absolute saviour for promoting these issues and making us all aware of the challenges we've got and the opportunities in front of us. So thank you very much. And we wish you every success going as the engagement director for the CITB. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Mark. Thanks for having me.